Thank you. First, I just want to take the moment to enjoy looking out at all this humanity. Really beautiful. And that's not just a way to introduce myself. It really is the start of my talk. Because at the heart of humanity, and I see a lot of it here, a lot of humanity, but at the heart of who we are as human beings is choice. And this is freedom, right? Because freedom is choice. And this freedom is perhaps no more important than when our life hangs in the very balance of a choice. And this is my concept of fight or flight for today. Not in the reflexive, instinctive sense, but as a deliberate decision of how you respond to a threat of a violent attack. Do you choose to stand and defend yourself, to protect your life, or do you run for safety? Now, this philosophy may be a bit abstract, so today we'll apply it to a very specific context where prison inmates maybe don't have the same options as the rest of us. Most of us make choices every day, but rarely do these mean the difference between life and death. However, such situations are faced by prison inmates relatively frequently, but they don't have the same freedom of choice to choose to stand their ground and protect themselves or to run and hide. So if we're going to apply the philosophy of a freedom to protect your life to inmates, then first we should think about how someone becomes an inmate and first talk generally about the law. I'm a lawyer, and so criminal law prohibits violence as a general proposition, right? The criminal code defines certain crimes like assault and murder, among others. And this is a prohibition on the general use of violence. However, there's an exception carved out for when we need to defend ourselves. This is the self-defense doctrine, a proportionate amount of force necessary to repel an imminent illegal attack. This basically means you can defend yourself with force just enough that's necessary to protect your life without facing criminal liability or punishment afterwards. Now, what's interesting about the normative aspect of the self-defense doctrine is that it makes criminal activity or violent activity that would be prohibited by law actually no longer wrongful. It's judged as legally right by the law. And perhaps more importantly, society looks at our force, our violence that we use to defend ourselves, and at times sees that as morally right. There's a moral right to use force to defend yourself, to defend your very life. So, if this is a moral right that's afforded to us in society, and we consider that, well, maybe this is a part of our freedom of choice, our freedom to choose life as a part of humanity, what does it say when we treat those in society with less freedom, less respect for their life, such as prison inmates? How does a person become a prison inmate? This will help guide us to our ultimate goal of applying this in context. The state presents evidence, proves to a court beyond a reasonable doubt that that defendant sitting over there committed the wrongful act with the criminal mind. They intended to cause harm or they intended a harmful action. And now as a convicted criminal, we punish them. And for this breach of our social moral code, this could include incarceration, imprisonment. Some of the purposes of imprisonment actually relate to fight or flight, don't they? Well, of course, we talk about retribution, revenge, or rehabilitating the criminal. But at the core of incarcerating a criminal is public safety. We want to limit their freedom of movement, take them out of society, make sure they can't move freely, and thereby protecting the rest of us and making us safe. Now let's travel inside the prison, into that prison environment. What is it like for that newly convicted criminal? While imprisonment, incarceration of prisoners, has as its aim to make society safer, the environment that that convicted criminal goes into is anything but safe. Imagine taking the most aggressive, the most violent members of society and concentrating them into one confined space. In a veritable fortress, prison walls are like a fortress designed to keep those criminals in a close quarters, really, with other violent and dangerous people. It's no wonder that statistically, prison violence is a well-documented phenomenon around the world. Not universally seen, but in most societies there's some degree of prison violence. Life in prison is simply violent for some inmates. So, faced with that violence, that newly convicted criminal has a heightened risk of a threat of violence, of attack, in a space where their liberty is restrained. Right? So, not all prison inmates are violent. Many people are in prison for convictions for nonviolent crimes. They're not necessarily violent people. But these are the very people who are the most at risk. They're targeted as easy prey by aggressive, violent offenders for physical, even sexual violence. And it is in this environment where we said there's liberty of movement, their freedom to move is restricted. They don't have an easy escape route, do they? And so when we're incarcerating people and we're putting them into these violent situations, they have nowhere to run from the violent attack. So the rest of us would enjoy something known as self-defense. If we have a duty to retreat, sometimes the law requires a duty to retreat. Some legal systems say, well, you in society, if you can run, then you have to try running, you have to try escaping before you actually can turn and face your attacker. But interestingly, many countries reject a duty to retreat because they say this is right giving way to wrong. This is wrong triumphing over right, and that the wrong prevails over the right. However, somehow this paradigm, this philosophy flips in prison, where we deprive a right to flee, and thereby that prison inmate faced with violence has only two options. No longer fight or flight. It's fight or submit. And now you say, oh, come on, it's not that simple. Obviously, there are other options. Talk to a prison guard, report it to prison authorities. Of course, procedurally, there are options for making complaints in prison. This, however, carries a greater risk of future violence, retaliation from the same aggressor. Maybe the aggressor has compatriots or friends or gang members. It's just simply impossible for prison authorities to prevent all violence at all times. So indeed, when faced with this scenario, fight or submit, this seems already like a drastic reduction in the liberty. The criminal convict, by committing a crime, forfeited their liberty of movement. Does that mean they should also forfeit their right to run away from a fight? You'll be surprised to hear that their options may be even more restricted than this. In still some legal systems, the self-defense doctrine, as I described, is not available to prison inmates. And so, standing up to an attacker in a prison area where there's little room to move, no room to retreat, the only options are to stand and fight or to submit to violence, brutal violence. The option to stand and fight will wind up prolonging their sentences. It's a crime of assault with no availability of the self-defense doctrine. So what kind of choice? So we talk about freedom of choice. Self-defense in prison is a non-choice. It either is an attempt to avert a present violence now, but only in exchange for future violence, years being exposed to additional violence. It's a non-choice, either violence now or submit. So we wonder what this says about our view of humanity. We have a philosophy that we have a right to life. We have freedom of choice. Think about the choices that you make, and today you'll make choices, other days you'll make choices. They may not all be a matter of life and death, but it does give us reason to be aware of the freedom that we enjoy when we make our choices. Yet, can we deprive other humans of such a choice, the freedom to preserve their own life? What does this say about our view of the humanity of prisoners? I believe, and I propose, that all people have to have a right to defend themselves. We have a freedom to choose how to preserve your life when justified, and every person, every human should enjoy this right. Now, prisoners, convicted criminals, are still human too. And I thank you for listening.